Wade Mercer snatched the microphone right out of the auctioneer's hand. Nobody stopped him. Nobody tried. Because in Culver County, Wade Mercer didn't ask for things. He took them, and the room let him. 40 head of broke-down oxen, he announced, turning to face the crowd with that slow, satisfied smile of a man who already knew how every story ended. And who's buying them? He pointed straight at Mara Ellsworth, 23 years old, standing alone in the back corner in her dead grandfather's coat, 3 sizes too big. This little girl right here spent every dollar she had. He let the laughter build before he finished. Honey, your granddaddy was senile, and so are you. The room erupted. Mara didn't flinch. She signed the bill of sale with a hand that didn't shake. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already decided that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. If you've ever been laughed at for believing in something nobody else could see, stay with me. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if something in these first few minutes already got under your skin, tap that like button. It helps more than you know. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Thomas Ellsworth was buried, the temperature in Culver County dropped 11 degrees before noon. Nobody commented on it. Mountain weather did what it wanted, and the people who'd lived in the shadow of Greer's Ridge long enough had stopped trying to read meaning into cold snaps and sudden fogs. But Mara noticed. She stood at the graveside in that oversized coat, her grandfather's coat, the one that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and something she couldn't name, something old and animal and good, and she felt the cold move through the wool like it was trying to reach her directly. Like the mountain itself was pressing a hand against her chest and saying, "Pay attention." Thomas Ellsworth had farmed that ridge for 51 years. He'd outlasted 2 wives, 1 barn fire, and a bank foreclosure that would have finished most men. He hadn't finished. He'd bent, reorganized his debts with a stubbornness that bordered on irrational, and kept going. The farm had never been prosperous, not in any way a county assessor would measure, but it had been alive, and Thomas had treated that aliveness as the only currency that mattered. When he died, he left Mara the land, the debt, and 6 handwritten journals with water-stained covers and ink so faded in places it looked like the words were trying to disappear. He left her nothing else. No cash, no livestock, no functioning equipment. The last tractor had been sold 3 years earlier to cover a property tax bill, and the barn held nothing but rusted tools, a broken harness, and approximately 40 years of decisions that hadn't quite worked out. Mara had driven up from Asheville the day she got the call. She'd been working as a line cook at a restaurant that paid slightly better than nothing, sharing an apartment with 2 other women, and telling herself she'd figure out the bigger questions later. Now later had arrived, wearing the face of a mountain farm with $34,000 in back debt and no clear path forward. She wasn't a farmer. She'd grown up visiting the ridge for summers, helping her grandfather with tasks she'd understood only partially, holding things, handing him tools, walking fence lines while he talked more to the trees than to her. She knew the land the way you know a language you studied as a child and never practiced. Certain rhythms, certain textures, but the vocabulary mostly gone. What she had was the coat and the journals and stubbornness, and she wasn't yet sure which of those 3 things was most dangerous. The first journal was almost entirely weather records. The second was a combination of soil observations and what appeared to be philosophical arguments with himself. The third was where it started getting strange. Thomas had written about water, specifically about the way water moved beneath the surface of Greer's Ridge, not in the way a geologist would write about it, with proper terminology and measured data, but in the way a man who had watched the same piece of land for half a century writes about it, with the particular authority of someone who has made every possible mistake and survived them all. The spring didn't disappear, he'd written, in handwriting that had grown shakier over the years, but no less precise. It went underground. The compaction did it, years of heavy equipment, cattle that weren't moved often enough, the drought of '89 that cracked the surface and let the hardpan set like concrete. The water is still there. I can feel it when I walk the hollow. The ground sounds different. It has a kind of hollow to it, like a drum with something inside. Mara read that 3 times sitting on the porch in the dark, her breath making small clouds. The next page had a single line, written and underlined twice. Choose the heaviest ones with the slowest feet. Put them back on the hill. She didn't understand it yet, but she wrote it in the small notebook she'd started carrying because her grandfather had been a man who didn't waste words, and if he'd underlined something twice, it mattered. It was her great-aunt Ruth who first mentioned the auction. Ruth Ellsworth was 81 years old and lived in a house so full of accumulated objects that navigating it required actual attention. She and Mara sat at her kitchen table the week after the funeral, drinking coffee from mismatched cups, and Ruth said without preamble, "Grantham's selling off those work oxen. The whole herd. Nobody wants them." "Where are they from?" "Old picket operation up past the gap. Calvin Pickett died. His son doesn't want the farm. The boy's been trying to sell the whole place, but nobody's buying, so he's auctioning the animals separate." Ruth set her cup down. 40 head. Old animals, most of them. Some have been working for 15 years. Calvin kept good records, but nobody cares. They want the new Massey Ferguson they're putting up after, and those oxen are just in the way. Mara asked, carefully, "How much?" Ruth looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Cheap. But that's not really the question, is it?" Mara didn't answer. She was thinking about her grandfather's words, the heaviest ones with the slowest feet. She had $8,400 in a savings account. It was everything she had. She'd been saving it for 3 years with the vague idea that someday it would become a down payment on something, though she'd never been clear on what that something was. She drove to the auction on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 weeks after the funeral. She told herself she was just going to look. The Grantham sale ground was already packed when she arrived, and the Massey Ferguson, a new model, red as a wound, gleaming under the thin autumn sun, was parked at the entrance like a welcome sign. Men stood around it the way men stand around things they want, tilted toward it, hands in pockets, speaking low. Mara walked past it without stopping. The oxen were in a holding pen at the far end of the lot. They were not, she had to acknowledge, impressive to look at. 40 animals, most of them with the kind of dullness in the eye that comes from years of hard work and indifferent feed. They stood close together with the patience of creatures that had learned patience was all they had. Some of them were massive, genuinely enormous, with shoulders that sat above Mara's head, but that size looked less like power and more like history, like all the work was visible in their bodies somehow. She walked the outside of the pen slowly. She was looking for something, and she wasn't entirely sure what it was. Her grandfather had written, "Heaviest ones with the slowest feet." She watched how they moved when they shifted. Most of them moved like you'd expect exhausted animals to move, economically, without enthusiasm. But some of them moved differently. Not lazily, deliberately, like they were choosing each step. She had her notebook out. She was counting and circling when the voice came from behind her. "You lost, sweetheart?" She turned. Wade Mercer was standing 6 feet away with 2 other men, ranchers she recognized but didn't know by name. And he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who finds something funny that hasn't been made into a joke yet. Wade Mercer was 54 years old and owned more land in Culver County than anyone except the timber company. He was not a cruel man exactly. Cruelty implies some kind of intention, but he was a man who had never once in his life been told he was wrong by anyone he respected, which had produced in him a casual certainty about everything that functioned exactly like cruelty. "Just looking," Mara said. "At what?" "These animals are done. Calvin worked them hard for 20 years. His boy kept them on poor pasture for 3 more. Ain't a buyer with sense within 100 miles. He glanced at her notebook. "You writing a school report?" She ignored that. "Do you know what their weight runs?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise him. "Weight?" "The bigger ones, the ones that move slow." He exchanged a look with one of the other men. "Why on earth would that matter?" "Just curious," she said. He laughed. It was a sociable laugh, not a mean one. The kind of laugh that assumed you were in on the joke. "Honey, if you're thinking about buying any of these animals for farm work, let me save you the trouble. A good modern tractor does the work of everything in that pen in about 1/8 of the time. And it doesn't eat when it's not working." He smiled. "Unless you've got money to throw away." "I appreciate the advice," Mara said, and turned back to the pen. He stood there a moment longer, like he expected a different response, and then his two companions drew him away toward the Massey Ferguson, and he forgot about her. She kept her notebooks out. She kept counting. By the time the auction started, she had marked 15 animals. She didn't have a strategy exactly. She had a feeling, which was worse, because feelings are harder to argue with and also harder to defend. She stood near the back of the crowd and listened to the auctioneer move through the lots, and she felt the savings account in her mind like a physical weight, like she was holding it in both hands. The first lot of oxen went for less than she expected. People were bidding because they thought they might find use for one or two, or because the price was low enough that walking away felt like waste. But the enthusiasm was thin. The real crowd wanted the tractor. When the larger animals came up, the ones she'd marked, the bidding was even thinner. These were older, heavier, slower. One man bid on 3 of them for slaughter price and then stopped. Nobody else entered. Mara raised her number. The auctioneer looked at her with mild surprise. She bid again. The slaughter buyer shrugged and dropped out. She bought that lot for $410. She did it 11 more times. When the last lot was gavelled and she walked to the registration table to sign, her hands were steady, and her stomach was doing something that wasn't quite nausea and wasn't quite excitement, but existed somewhere between the two like weather before a storm. The total came to $7,840. She had 41 oxen. She'd bought 1 extra by accident, misreading her own notes in the moment, and $560 left in her account, and no feed, and a barn that needed work, and 37 miles between her and Greer's Ridge. She was standing at the table organizing her paperwork when she heard the microphone feedback. She turned. Wade Mercer had taken the auctioneer's microphone, not grabbed it exactly, just placed his hand on it in a way that made the auctioneer step back. Because that's how it worked with men like Wade. Things moved aside before he had to ask. And he was facing the crowd, and he was pointing at her. She remembered this later in pieces. Not the whole thing at once. She remembered the laugh that came from somewhere to her left. She remembered one of the women from the county extension office looking away, not laughing, but not intervening either. She remembered the word senile because it was the word that went deepest, not because it hurt her, but because he'd said it about her grandfather, and Thomas Ellsworth had been the most precise man she'd ever known. And calling him senile was not an insult to her. It was an insult to 51 years of careful attention to a piece of land. And that was a different category of wrong entirely. She remembered that she signed the bill of sale while he was still talking. Her hand didn't shake. She remembered walking out past the Massey Ferguson without looking at it. What came after was harder than the auction. Mara drove back to the ridge that afternoon and sat on the porch steps in the cold and looked at the barn and the fields and the winter coming in over the top of the mountain, and she did something she almost never allowed herself to do. She did the math honestly. The debt was real. The feed costs were real. The fact that she had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 3 weeks was real. The fact that she didn't entirely know what she was doing was very, very real. She opened the 3rd journal to the page she'd bookmarked. Choose the heaviest ones with the slowest feet. Put them back on the hill. Okay, Pop, she said, to no one. Okay. The oxen arrived at the ridge the following Thursday in a borrowed trailer that took 3 trips. Moving them up the mountain road was slow. They came off the trailer uncertain, blinking in the thin light, placing their enormous feet with the caution of animals that have learned not to trust new ground. And getting them into the pasture took longer than she'd planned, and she was sweating through her jacket by the time the gate was latched. She stood at the fence afterward and looked at them. They looked back. There was nothing in their expression that resembled gratitude, which she appreciated. They were animals. They were assessing whether the new situation was safe, whether there was water, whether she was a threat. She was not a threat. She was a 23-year-old woman with 60 days of feed money, a dead grandfather's journals, and a herd of discarded animals that the county believed were going to ruin her. All right, she said quietly. Let's figure this out together. One of the big ones, she'd started thinking of him as the general, for no reason she could articulate, lifted his enormous head and looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away toward the ridge, toward the hickory hollow she hadn't yet walked, toward something she couldn't see. She made a note of it. The nights were the hardest part of that first month. Not the work. The work was exhausting but legible. It had tasks inside it that could be completed, and completion was its own comfort. The nights were different. The nights were when the math came back, when the voice that sounded unfortunately like common sense asked her what exactly she thought she was proving and whether proving it was worth the cost. She answered it the only way she knew how. She read the journals. Thomas Ellsworth had not been a man who expressed emotion easily or often. He'd been raised by people who treated sentiment as a kind of weakness, and that training had left marks. But the journals were different. In the journals, he'd allowed himself something. Not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Honesty, maybe. The particular honesty of a man writing to no audience, recording observations he wasn't sure mattered, following hunches he couldn't fully explain. He'd written about the hollow on the northwest side of the ridge, the one surrounded by hickory trees that were older than the county records. He'd written about how the ground there sounded different when you struck it, a note he described as hollow, which he'd underlined, and then crossed out, and then written again. He'd written about water tables and compaction and the old ways of reading a landscape that the county extension agents had stopped teaching sometime in the 1970s, and he'd written, in the fifth journal, something that Mara read 3 times before she understood it. The oxen always knew before I did. They'd stop in the hollow and not move. I used to get frustrated and push them on. It took me 20 years to understand they weren't being stubborn. They were listening. She closed the journal. She sat with that for a while. The next morning, she stopped trying to direct the herd and started watching where they went on their own. It took 4 days before the pattern became undeniable. Every single morning, by midday, the animals drifted to the same place, the northwest hollow, the hickory stand, the place her grandfather had written about. They didn't run there. They walked there slowly, with that deliberate choosing quality she'd noticed at the auction, and they stood there in the afternoon, and they were quieter there than anywhere else on the ridge. Mara stood at the edge of the hollow on the 5th day and looked at the ground. Then she knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the earth, the way her grandfather had described doing, the way that felt foolish until it didn't. The ground was cooler than it should have been, not dramatically, not obviously, but measurably cooler than the surrounding soil, even in the October warmth. She pressed harder, and it was probably her imagination, but she thought she felt something. Not movement exactly, but the potential of movement, the particular density of ground that has water running beneath it, deeper than the roots could reach. She stood up. She looked at the 41 animals watching her with their calm, assessing eyes. "I think I'm starting to understand," she said. The general put his head down and pulled a mouthful of grass, which was not an answer, but it wasn't a contradiction either. She went inside and read the journals until midnight, and what she was building, slowly, imperfectly, from her grandfather's words and the animal's instincts and her own stubborn refusal to concede that she'd made a catastrophic mistake, was beginning to look less like a hope and more like a plan. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell who wouldn't laugh, but she kept her notebook, and she kept walking the hollow, and she kept watching the way the heaviest animals with the slowest feet moved across the ground, pressing it, working it, their enormous weight doing something to the compacted earth that she was only beginning to understand. The mountain was keeping its secret, but it was starting to feel, to Mara, like a secret that wanted to be found. The cold settled into the ridge the way it always did in late October. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a person eases into a difficult conversation, testing the temperature before committing. Mara had been on the mountain for 6 weeks. She'd stopped counting the days sometime around the end of the 3rd week, when counting started to feel like a way of measuring how much she hadn't accomplished, and she had enough of that already without keeping a formal record. The routine had built itself without her planning it. She was up before 5, checking water, checking feed, walking the fence line in the dark with a flashlight that had a failing battery she kept forgetting to replace. The big animals needed more feed than she'd originally calculated. She'd done her math based on average weights, and these were not average animals. These were the heavy ones. The slow ones, the ones nobody had wanted, and their maintenance costs reflected that. She'd had to call the feed supplier twice to adjust her order, and both times the man on the phone had been polite in the particular way that people are polite when they think you're making a mistake. The notebooks were multiplying on the kitchen table. She'd started 3 new ones beyond the small one she'd carried to the auction, and they were developing a system of their own. Movement patterns in the mornings, water behavior after rain, the way the herd sorted itself by the time they reached the hollow. She didn't know what she was building yet. She was collecting, the way her grandfather had collected in his journals, with the faith that the pattern would eventually declare itself. It was the hollow that was starting to keep her awake at night. Not with anxiety exactly, with something more like pressure, the feeling of a thought that was almost complete, that kept arriving at the edge of her understanding and then sliding back before she could get a grip on it. She'd read her grandfather's 5th journal so many times, the binding was starting to separate. She knew the relevant passages by memory now, could recite them in the dark. The ground sounds different, the hollow to it, like a drum with something inside. She'd started doing what he described, striking the ground with her heel in different places, listening. Most of the ridge gave back the same flat thud you'd expect from packed mountain soil. But in the hollow, in the hickory stand, the sound shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd notice if you weren't listening for it. But it was there. A faint, slightly different resonance, the note half a step lower than the surrounding earth, like the ground was sitting over something that wasn't entirely solid. She told this to Ruth during her weekly visit, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with the same mismatched cups. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. "He used to say the water was alive under there," Ruth said finally. "I thought he was being poetic." "He wasn't being poetic," Mara said. "He was being literal. He just didn't have the language to explain it in a way people would take seriously." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet. The oxen keep going back there, every day, without being directed." "Animals know ground," Ruth said simply. "Always have. We just stopped listening to them when we started listening to machines instead." She picked up her cup. "Your grandfather used to say that too. Nobody wanted to hear it. Did he ever try anything? To get to the water?" Ruth was quiet for long enough that Mara thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "He tried once. With a rented excavator, early 90s, tore up half the hollow before he gave up. Said the machine was doing it wrong, going too deep, disrupting the capillary structure, whatever that meant." She paused. "He never rented equipment again after that. Said it was the worst mistake he made on that mountain." Mara drove home thinking about that. The worst mistake he made on that mountain. And he'd made a lot of mistakes, Thomas Ellsworth had. The journals documented them with unsentimental honesty, each one annotated with what he'd learned and what he wished he'd done differently. For excavating the hollow to make the list above everything else said something significant about what the hollow meant to him and what he believed was still possible there. She pulled into the farm drive and sat in the truck for a minute, looking at the barn. Then she went inside and opened the 4th journal to a section she hadn't spent enough time on. A cluster of entries from the winter of 2003, when Thomas had written extensively about something he called traditional cultivation pressure, a phrase that appeared nowhere else in the journals, and that Mara had initially skipped past as one of his more obscure tangents. She read it carefully this time. He'd been corresponding with a retired agricultural historian from a university she'd never heard of, a man named Aldous Vreek, who had apparently spent 40 years documenting pre-mechanized farming techniques from the Appalachian region. Thomas had written out portions of their conversations in the journal, his own handwriting recording what Vreeke had told him, and what Vreek had told him was this. In the mountain communities of the 18th and early 19th century, farmers had known about springs that went underground under compacted soil, and they had known how to find them, and the method they used was not excavation. It was pressure. Specific, distributed, patient pressure applied by draft animals. Not horses, specifically, because horses were too light and moved too quickly. Oxen. The heavy breeds, the slow breeds, the ones that placed each foot with deliberation and whose combined weight, walked repeatedly across a specific area in specific patterns, could shift soil compaction at a depth that no surface tool could reach. The old men knew, Thomas had written in his own words, underlining it. They knew which animals to use and how to walk them. The water didn't need to be found. It needed to be let out. Mara read that sentence 5 times. Then she sat very still in the kitchen chair, in the October quiet, with the sound of the herd settling down for the night coming faintly through the wall, and she understood what her grandfather had left her. Not the land, not the debt, not even the journals. He'd left her the herd, the specific herd, the heaviest ones with the slowest feet. He hadn't been speaking generally. He'd been writing a set of instructions. He'd known about the picket oxen, or animals like them, or perhaps he'd simply known what to look for, and he'd trusted that she would find them and follow the logic to where it led. She was so tired that her hands were shaking slightly, which happened sometimes now when she went too long without eating. She got up and made herself toast and ate it standing at the counter, and then she went back to the journals. By midnight, she had a plan. It was an incomplete plan, riddled with things she didn't know and couldn't yet solve, but it had a shape. It had a direction. And for the first time since she'd signed that bill of sale, she felt something that wasn't dread. The problem was that she didn't know how to do it. She knew cattle, roughly. She'd helped her grandfather work with cattle, had a general sense of animal handling, could manage the herd's basic needs with the competence of someone who had learned by doing and was still mostly doing it wrong and correcting as she went. But working oxen, using them as working animals, directing them in coordinated effort across specific terrain, that was a different thing entirely. The last person who had done that on Greer's Ridge had been Thomas himself, and he was in the ground, and his journals stopped in 2019. She asked Ruth about it. Ruth thought for a while and then said, "There's a man named Harlan Beach. Used to farm up past the Crestview Gap with a team. He's old now, must be in his mid-70s. He might know someone." Harlan Beach did not know someone, but Harlan Beach knew things. He agreed to come out to the farm on a Saturday in November, and he walked through the pasture with Mara for 2 hours, looking at the animals with the eyes of a man who had spent decades understanding them, and what he said was not encouraging. "These animals haven't worked in years," he told her, standing at the fence of the upper pasture with his hands in his jacket pockets. "You can see it in how they carry themselves. They were good animals once. Well-trained, you can still see the traces of it, but they've been left idle long enough that you'd have to start almost from the beginning." "How long would that take?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Depends on the animals, depends on the handler. You ever worked oxen before?" "No." "Trained any working animals?" "Dogs," she said, "and a mule, once, for about a week." He looked at her. "A mule for a week." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He was watching the general, who had come to the near fence and was standing there with his enormous head over the top rail, regarding Harlan with the same calm assessment he brought to everything. Harlan reached out and put his hand on the animal's nose, slowly, with the confidence of long experience, and the general didn't move. "This one's been well handled," Harlan said. "Somebody put serious time into him." "Calvin Pickett," Mara said, "the man I bought them from. His father worked them for years. The son didn't know what he had." "Most people don't." Harlan withdrew his hand and looked back at Mara. "What exactly are you trying to do with them? You said something about the Northwest Hollow." She told him. All of it. The journals, the hollow, the compaction theory, what Thomas had believed about the water beneath the surface. She expected skepticism. Harlan was a practical man, a man of tangible things, and what she was describing was, she was aware of how it sounded, something between agricultural theory and faith. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pulled at the collar of his jacket and looked out toward the hickory stand, visible from where they stood as a dark smudge against the ridge. "Your grandfather mentioned Aldous Vreek in those journals?" he asked. She stared at him. "You know about Vreekie?" "Heard of him. Some of the old-timers used to talk about this idea. Pressure cultivation, they called it, or something like it. The language changed depending on who was talking. The concept was always the same. Heavy draft animals, patient walking, shallow pattern work." He paused. "I always thought it was more legend than practice, but your grandfather believed it." "He tried it with the excavator and failed," Mara said. "He wrote that the machine went too deep, disrupted something." Harlan nodded slowly. "That tracks. The theory is that you're not trying to break through the hard pan. You're trying to shift it incrementally. Vibration, weight distribution, the heat from the animals themselves, all of it working together over time. An excavator tears, the oxen press." He looked at the general again. "It would need to be done just right. Shallow furrows, patient repetition, specific patterns across the hollow." "Can you teach me to work them?" He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the cold coming down off the ridge and wished she'd worn a heavier jacket. I'm 73 years old, he said. My knees are bad and my back is worse, and I haven't worked a full ox team in 11 years. He paused. I can teach you what I know. Whether it's enough, so that depends on the animals and on you and on whether your grandfather was right about what's under that ground. When can you start? He almost smiled. You're not a person who waits, are you? I can't afford to be, she said simply. Harlan came back the following Monday, and the Monday after that, and every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 3 weeks, in the cold and sometimes in sleet, working with Mara and with the two animals she'd identified as the strongest and most responsive. The general and a second large ox she'd named simply Pear, because he was always where the general was, as if they'd made some private arrangement. The training was not smooth. Nothing about those weeks was smooth. Mara made mistakes that Harlan corrected without condescension, but also without softening. He was a man who had lived long enough to believe that imprecision in animal handling cost you more in the long run than the discomfort of honest correction did. She bruised her right hand badly on the third day trying to manage a yoke adjustment that went wrong. She lost the pair twice in the first week, once for 4 hours in the lower wood, because she'd misread a signal and the animals had taken advantage of the confusion. But she learned. She learned the language of it, which was mostly physical, the weight and angle of her own body, the direction of her voice, the particular rhythm of command that these animals had been trained to respond to decades ago and had not entirely forgotten. She learned that patience was not passive. It was an active choice that required renewal every few minutes, a decision to stay present rather than push, to wait rather than force. The general was the key. He was not the most tractable animal in the herd. He had opinions and he expressed them. But he was the smartest, and when he decided to work with her, the other large animals followed his assessment. Getting the general to decide she was worth following had taken most of the first 2 weeks and had involved more failed attempts than she was comfortable admitting even to her notebook. But on the morning of their third Tuesday together, something shifted. She'd arrived at the pasture before Harlan and found the general already at the near gate, standing there in the cold gray light as if he'd been waiting. She'd approached him slowly, and he'd let her come close, and he'd looked at her with those calm, dark eyes, and she'd had the irrational but unmistakable feeling that he'd made a decision. She'd put her hand on his neck, and he'd leaned into it, very slightly. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." When Harlan arrived 20 minutes later, he stopped at the gate and watched the two of them for a moment before he climbed over. "What happened?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "He just decided." Harlan nodded like that was a complete explanation. "That's how it works," he said. "They have to choose to do it. You can't train them into it. You can only make yourself someone worth choosing." The county, meanwhile, had not forgotten about Mara Ellsworth and her 40 oxen. If anything, the story had calcified into a kind of local legend. The foolish girl from Asheville who'd blown her savings on livestock nobody wanted and was going to lose the mountain farm her grandfather had left her. It was the kind of story that made people feel instructive, like it contained a lesson worth repeating. And it got repeated at feed stores and diners, and at the end of bar counters when people ran out of other things to say. Wade Mercer repeated it most often. He was not doing it with specific malice. It wasn't as intentional as that. But he had a social gift for stories that confirmed his existing beliefs, and the Ellsworth girl's failure confirmed a belief he'd held for a long time. That sentiment was a bad substitute for sense, and that young women who inherited land they didn't understand should sell it to people who did. His ranch hand, a young man named Evan Brooks, heard the story probably a dozen times before he stopped listening to it. Evan was 17 and had been working for Wade Mercer since the summer, doing fence work and general labor for an hourly rate that wasn't generous, but was steadier than anything else available in Culver County to a 17-year-old with a mediocre school record and no particular plan. He was good with animals, better than he was with most other things, and he had a quality that the people who knew him had difficulty naming, but that amounted to something like, he paid attention. He noticed things. He kept what he noticed to himself because there wasn't generally anyone around who seemed interested in hearing it. He heard the Ellsworth story and thought it sounded like there was more to it than Wade Mercer's version. He didn't say so. He kept going to work, kept doing his fences, kept thinking. Then one Tuesday in late November, he was repairing a section of Mercer's fence line that ran along the county road near the base of Greer's Ridge, and he looked up and saw a woman walking 2 oxen along the logging trail at the edge of the upper pasture. The animals were enormous. They moved with a slowness that looked almost intentional, like they were trying to feel each step. And the woman was walking with them in a way that wasn't driving. It was more like accompanying, like she was part of the movement rather than directing it. He watched for almost 10 minutes before he realized his work had completely stopped. That weekend, he drove out to the Ellsworth farm. He didn't call ahead because he didn't have the number, and also because he wasn't sure he'd actually go through with it if he had time to think about it too much. Mara was in the barn when he pulled up, replacing a section of harness leather that had cracked in the cold. She looked up when he came in, and he saw her register his youth and his Mercer Ranch jacket, and he watched her decide something quickly. "You work for Mercer," she said. Not an accusation, a fact. "Yes, ma'am. I saw you working the oxen on Tuesday." He stopped. He didn't know exactly what to say next. "I'm good with animals. I've been working cattle since I was 12. I thought maybe—" He stopped again. "You thought maybe what?" "I thought maybe you needed help," he said. "And I thought maybe it would be— I don't know. I just wanted to see what you were doing." She looked at him for a long moment. She was evaluating him the same way the general evaluated things, directly, without performance. "What's your name?" "Evan Brooks." "Does Wade Mercer know you're here?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably not." She almost smiled. "You any good with a yoke pin?" "I've never worked oxen," he admitted, "but I learn fast and I don't complain, and I won't tell you I know something when I don't." That last part seemed to matter. She straightened up from the harness and looked at him for another moment, and then she nodded, once, the way his grandmother used to nod when she'd decided something and didn't need to discuss it further. "Be here Saturday at 6, she said. "Bring work boots if you've got them. We're going to try walking the hollow." He was there at 5:45. He wore the work boots. The first walk through the hollow with all 4 of them, Mara, Evan, the general, and Pear, produced nothing dramatic. Nothing dramatic was expected. What Mara was learning from Harlan, and what she was beginning to understand from her grandfather's journals in a way that went deeper than intellectual comprehension, was that this was not a process with a clear visible before and after. It was incremental. It was cumulative. Each pass of the oxen across the hollow was one more application of weight, one more infinitesimal shift in soil compaction at a depth where the casual observer would see nothing changing at all. But she was measuring. She'd started taking soil temperature readings in the hollow and in the surrounding pasture, using a probe thermometer she'd ordered online. And the numbers were doing something small but consistent. The hollow was running cooler than the surrounding earth by a margin that had been growing slowly since the animals started spending time there. Not dramatically. 2 degrees, then 3, then back to 2. But the pattern held. She showed Evan the data on a Saturday morning in December, sitting in the kitchen with the journals spread around them and the thermometer readings laid out in her notebook. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means the ground is changing," she said. "The water is close. Closer than it was." She pressed her finger against the notebook page. "My grandfather thought the spring sealed itself under the hardpan during the 1989 drought. 40 years of compaction on top of that. But it's still there. The water doesn't disappear. It just stops having a way out." "And the oxen are making a way?" "Not cutting through, shifting. There's a difference." She looked for the words. "Think about a cork in a bottle. You don't have to break the cork. You just have to change the pressure differential enough that it moves." Evan was quiet, looking at the numbers. He wasn't a person who nodded along to things he didn't understand, which Mara had already identified as one of his better qualities. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. That's the honest answer. I don't know. She closed the notebook. Maybe it doesn't work at all. Maybe my grandfather was wrong, or I'm interpreting the journals wrong, or the compaction is too deep and the weight isn't sufficient. She said this evenly, without drama, because she'd already had this conversation with herself many times, and she was past the stage where saying it out loud frightened her. Maybe I lose the farm in the spring and the whole thing was a mistake. Evan looked at her. Do you think it was a mistake? She considered the question seriously. Outside, she could hear the herd moving, the slow percussion of 41 pairs of large feet on cold ground, the occasional low sound that the animals made not in distress but simply as a kind of presence, an announcement of themselves. "No," she said. "I think my grandfather was right. I think the water is there. I think those animals are the right animals, and I think the hollow is the right place." She paused. "I might not be the right person, but I'm the one who's here." Evan nodded at that. Slowly, like he was putting it somewhere he could keep it. The drought notice from the county arrived the following week. It was formal, bureaucratic, printed on county letterhead, the kind of document that strips the urgency out of urgent things by burying them in procedural language. But the content was clear. Culver County was entering its second consecutive dry year. Water table readings across the valley were declining, and farmers were being advised to plan for restricted irrigation allocation in the coming growing season. Mara read it twice and set it on the kitchen table next to the journals. The drought had been coming on slowly enough that it was easy to not see it if you weren't paying attention. The creek running lower than usual, the pastures drying faster, the ground in the lower fields going hard before November had even ended. She'd seen it, registered it, added it to the list of things bearing down on her from all sides. What she didn't fully understand yet was that the drought was about to change everything. Not just for her, but for every farm in the valley, and for the people who had laughed at her, and for Wade Mercer's certainty, and for the county's comfortable assumptions about which land was valuable and which was done. She folded the drought notice and put it in the back of the third journal, where Thomas had tucked other things that mattered. A seed catalog from 1987, a letter from a bank she'd never heard of, a photograph she didn't recognize of two men standing in front of a stone trough filled with bright running water. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The trough in the picture was at the base of a ridge that looked in the grainy black and white very much like the northwest face of Greer's Ridge. The men in the photograph were laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, it was there the whole time. We just had to ask right. She put the photograph back. She put on her jacket and went out to walk the hollow one more time before dark, the ground cold and firm beneath her boots, the hickory trees bare against the winter sky, and somewhere beneath her feet, deeper than she could measure, but closer than it had been yesterday, something that had been sealed away for 40 years was beginning, very slowly, to move. The antique plow took 3 weeks to find and another week to determine if it was salvageable. Mara had started looking for it in December, working backward from her grandfather's journals, which referenced a specific style of walking plow, a single-bottom, fixed moldboard design that the old Appalachian farmers had used for shallow cultivation work before steel disc plows replaced them entirely. Thomas had called it a soil tender in his notes, which wasn't a proper agricultural term, but described what he meant precisely enough. An implement that moved the surface without destroying what was beneath it. She'd asked Harlan first. He'd thought about it with the particular slowness of a man who had a lot of information stored in a disorganized interior library and needed time to retrieve the right file. "Orville Steck," he'd said finally, "out on the Reedsville Road. He collected old implements, had a barn full of them. He's been gone 10 years, but his daughter kept the property. Might be worth a call." The daughter, a woman named Patrice, who lived in Charlotte and managed the property remotely and with evident reluctance, had been willing to let Mara look through the barn for a flat fee of $200, payable upfront regardless of whether she found anything. Mara had agreed without negotiating, which she couldn't afford to do but did anyway because $200 was less than the cost of another week of indecision. The barn had been extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure. Patrice's father had spent decades pulling implements out of fields and fence rows and estate sales across 4 counties, and the barn held the accumulated evidence of that. Plows and cultivators, and harrows in various states of decay, some of them so far gone that they were recognizable only by shape, others that had been stored carefully and retained their basic structure under layers of surface rust. Mara had walked through it with a flashlight for an hour and a half, moving carefully between the rows, touching things to test their integrity, before she found it in the back corner under a canvas tarp that had mostly rotted through. The plow was old, older than most of what surrounded it. Single bottom, fixed moldboard, wooden beam that had dried and cracked in two places but had not split entirely. The metal share was heavily corroded but structurally intact. The handles were solid. Someone had painted it red at some point, probably in the 40s, and the paint had flaked to almost nothing, leaving a skin of rust underneath that was mostly cosmetic. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she paid Patrice her $200 and asked to borrow a truck with a trailer hitch. Getting the plow functional took the better part of 3 weeks, and the help of a man named Dix, who ran a small machine shop out of a converted garage 12 miles from the farm, and who agreed to work on it for material costs only after Mara explained what she was trying to do. Dix was in his 60s, largely silent, and had the hands of someone who had spent 40 years solving problems that other people had given up on. He replaced the share, reset the coulter, and did something careful and time-consuming to the wooden beam that involved steam and clamps and a kind of patience that Mara watched and tried to learn from. "You know how to use one of these?" he asked on the last day, wiping his hands on a rag that was past the point of serving any cleaning function. "I'm learning," she said. He looked at the plow and then at her. "Shallow," he said. "You keep it shallow. These old designs will go deep if you let them. Keep pressure on the handles, keep the share riding high. The minute you let it dig, you've done something you can't undo." "How shallow?" He held his thumb and forefinger about 3 inches apart. She nodded. "Your grandfather farmed this way?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question. Dix had known Thomas, or known of him, the way people in small mountain counties know of each other without being close. "He tried to," she said. "He didn't get far enough." Dix was quiet for a moment. "He was a stubborn man, Thomas Ellsworth. I mean that as a compliment." "So am I," she said. He almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that." The yokes were a different problem. The ones that had come with the picket animals were functional but poorly fitted. Calvin Pickett had apparently let them deteriorate over the last few years, and several of them had been repaired with materials that weren't suited to the purpose, and had begun to fail in ways that weren't always visible until they were under load. Harlan walked the barn with her on a Saturday morning in January and identified the ones that were genuinely dangerous and the ones that were merely inadequate. "You've got 3 pairs here that could work," he said. "The rest need rebuilding or replacing. Rebuilding is possible, but it takes time and it takes someone who knows wood. Do you know wood?" He looked at her sideways. "I know enough. I'm not a craftsman." "But you can do it?" He pulled his cap off and ran a hand over his head. "You know what I said about my knees and my back?" "I know," she said. "And I know I'm asking you to do things that are hard for you, and I don't take that lightly. But I don't have anyone else, and I don't have money to hire it out, and if there's anyone in this county who understands what these yokes need to do, it's you." It was a lot to say. She'd said it plainly without dressing it up, because Harlan was a man who responded to plainness. He put his cap back on. "I'll need oak," he said. "Good dry oak, not the green stuff from the mill." "I'll find it." She found it through Ruth, who knew a man who had a stack of seasoned lumber behind his house that had been sitting there for 8 years waiting for a project that hadn't materialized. The man sold it to Mara for $40 and threw in help loading it, which saved her a different kind of problem. Harlan worked on the yokes in the barn on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and Mara worked beside him, handing him things and learning the joinery as he went. And they didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed in quality from the early days. It was comfortable now, the silence of people who had established a shared understanding of what they were doing without needing to name it. Evan came on weekends and worked on everything else. He was good with his hands in a different way than Harlan. Less precise, more instinctive. The kind of good that comes from years of solving practical problems with whatever was available. He'd fixed a section of the upper fence that had been failing since October, had rebuilt the water trough in the north pasture, and had developed a relationship with Pear that Mara watched with something between amusement and relief. The big animal had been resistant to her handling in a way that wasn't aggressive but was consistent. A low-grade unwillingness, a preference for his own judgment over hers. And Evan had simply spent time with him, unhurried time, not trying to work him or manage him, and somewhere in that unhurried time something had resolved itself. "How'd you do that?" Mara asked on a Saturday morning in late January, watching Pear follow Evan across the pasture like a large, deliberate shadow. Evan shrugged. "I just sat with him for a while. Didn't try to do anything. Brought him something to eat, stayed nearby. He paused. My grandfather used to say animals don't trust people who are always trying to get something from them. They need to know you can just be there without wanting anything. Mara thought about that. She thought about all the things she'd been wanting from everything and everyone since October. From the journals, from the animals, from the mountain, from the hollow. She wondered if the hollow could feel the wanting, the way Pear apparently could, and whether that was part of why it had stayed sealed. She didn't say this to Evan. It sounded too much like the kind of thing that couldn't survive being said out loud. The training with the plow began in the last week of January, not in the hollow. Not yet. Mara started in the lower east pasture, a flat section that hadn't been cultivated in years, and that had no particular significance and could absorb her mistakes without consequence. She worked the general and Pear together, with the rebuilt yoke and the restored plow, and the first morning was a series of corrections. The plow going too deep, then too shallow, then pulling left because of a soil variation she hadn't anticipated, the animals misreading her signals twice and stopping completely on the third pass. Harlan stood at the pasture edge with his arms folded and watched. He called corrections in a voice that carried without being loud. Handles up, you're letting the share drag. Too wide on the turn, you'll lose them if you turn too wide. Slow down, you're walking faster than they want to go. That last one stopped her. She straightened up and looked at him. What? You're setting the pace, he said. You shouldn't be. Let them set it. Your job is direction, not speed. She stood there in the January cold with the reins loose in her hands and thought about that. Then she deliberately slowed her own walking to match what the animals were naturally doing, which was slower than she'd been moving, considerably slower, the heavy, deliberate pace she'd first noticed at the auction and had been unconsciously fighting against ever since. The difference was immediate. The plow steadied. The furrow that emerged behind them was straighter than anything she'd managed that morning. The general's ears, which had been swiveling with the particular attentiveness of an animal working too hard to compensate for an uncertain handler, relaxed. There, Harlan said from the fence. Just that. She walked 3 more passes before stopping. The cold had gotten into her hands through her gloves, and her right shoulder was aching from the handle pressure, but the last 3 passes had been clean. Not perfect. Nothing about any of this was perfect, but clean enough. Purposeful enough. She looked back at the row of shallow furrows behind her. 3 inches deep, maybe less in places. Just enough to turn the surface, to open the soil without breaking what was beneath it. Is it enough? She called to Harlan. He came off the fence and walked the length of the last furrow, looking at it. He crouched down, slowly, with the careful movement of a man who had learned to respect his own joints, and pressed his fingers into the turned soil. Keep practicing, he said. Another week on this ground before you go up to the hollow. Another week felt impossible. The feed costs were accelerating with the cold. The second payment on the farm debt was coming due in March, and she'd had to take on a small amount of additional debt to cover the plow restoration and the lumber, which she hadn't originally planned for and which had shaken her budget in ways she was still recalculating. The pressure of all of it was constant, not the panicking kind of pressure, not anymore, but the chronic kind, the kind you carry the way you carry a bad tooth, always present, occasionally spiking into something acute. But she took Harlan's week. She didn't have the right to hurry this. Evan worked with her every day that week after his Mercer shift ended. He never mentioned whether Wade Mercer had noticed his absence on weekends, and Mara didn't ask. She suspected Mercer had noticed and had made a comment, and she suspected Evan had said something non-committal and then continued doing what he'd decided to do, because that was consistent with who he was, and it was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. His ability to make a decision and then simply live inside it without constant renegotiation. On the last Friday of the week, after their final practice session on the east pasture, Evan stood at the fence and looked up toward the hickory stand. You think it'll work? He asked. I think it might, Mara said. That's different from thinking it will. What's the difference? She leaned on the fence beside him. Her hands were cold, and her boots were wet through from a section of ground that had been softer than it looked. Might means I've done what I can, and I don't know the rest yet. Will means I'm expecting something. My grandfather didn't expect things. He positioned himself to receive them. She paused, feeling the inadequacy of that. I'm not sure I'm explaining that right. No, I think that's right, Evan said. He was quiet for a moment. When do we go up? Monday, she said. First thing. The Sunday night before, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark in Thomas's bedroom. She'd been sleeping there since the second month, because the bed was the only one in the house that didn't have a broken slat, and also because there was something steadying about it, about sleeping in the room where he'd slept for 50 years, as if some portion of his patience had settled into the walls. And she went through the process in her mind. She went through it step by step, the way Harlan had taught her. Approach, alignment, first pass, angle of entry, depth pressure, handle height, turn radius, second pass. The particular quality of attention required to keep the share at the right depth while also managing the direction and the animals and the terrain, which in the hollow was uneven in ways the east pasture wasn't. She went through it until it became less like planning and more like prayer, which she recognized and didn't name. At 4:30 in the morning, she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the journals. She didn't read anything specific. She just sat with them, the way you sit with something that has meant a great deal to you, holding the presence of it rather than the content. She opened the fifth journal to the photograph. The two men at the stone trough, laughing at something outside the frame, the water visible even in the black and white, bright and quick over the stone edge. It was there the whole time. We just had to ask right. She was ready. Monday arrived with cloud cover and temperatures just above freezing and a wind off the ridge that cut sideways and didn't apologize for it. Evan was there at 5:40 as he always was, and Harlan arrived at 6 in his truck with a thermos of coffee he shared without ceremony. They harnessed the general and pair in the barn with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this enough times that the routine had become its own kind of language, each step following the last without needing to be named. Walking them up to the hollow took 20 minutes on the logging trail. The animals moved well in the cold. They were built for it, their size and mass making the temperature a minor consideration rather than an obstacle. And the general had the settled quality he always had when he'd decided a thing was worth doing. Pear followed close, his breath making small clouds in the air. Mara carried the plow handles. Evan carried the extra tack. Harlan walked behind them all, not carrying anything, watching everything. The hollow was quiet in a way it was only in winter, the hickory trees bare and the ground visible without the summer cover. She could see its shape more clearly now, the slight depression at the center, the way the earth curved inward, almost imperceptibly, toward a middle point that she'd marked with a small stake back in November. That point was where the soil temperature differential was most consistent. That was where Thomas had written about hearing the different sound. She stopped the animals at the edge. "One pass first," Harlan said from behind, "across the grain of the slope. Keep the share at 2.5 inches. Don't go deeper." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." She positioned herself behind the plow, took the handles, found her footing. She said the word to the general, and he moved forward, and Pear moved with him, and the share bit the surface of the hollow ground with a sound she hadn't expected. Not the scraping drag of the east pasture soil, but something slightly different, a lower register, a sound with more give to it. The first pass took 4 minutes. The furrow that emerged behind the share was clean and shallow, the turned soil darker than the surface crust, and it was, she noticed it immediately, could not have not noticed it, cooler. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, visibly cooler in the way that wet sand is visibly cooler than dry sand, a depth of color rather than a surface temperature, a quality of the earth that said, something is different here. She stopped at the far edge and looked back. Evan was standing very still. Harlan was crouching at the near end of the furrow with his hand in the turned soil. "Again," he said. She turned the team, slowly, with the wide arc she'd practiced. Got them repositioned, made the second pass parallel to the first, 18 inches offset. The same sound, lower than the surrounding soil, the same darkness of the turned earth. On the third pass, 6 inches from the second, something changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the resistance against the handles. Not a hard obstruction, not a rock or a root, but a change in the quality of the pressure, as if the soil had become suddenly less unanimous about holding its shape. The share rode through it without catching, and she almost didn't stop, but her hands felt it, and she stopped. She looked down. The furrow was wet. Not dramatically wet, not pooled, not running, but the soil in this third furrow was dark with moisture in a way the first two hadn't been, a visible saturation that hadn't been present 12 inches to the right. She stood there without moving. Behind her, she heard Evan's sharp intake of breath. "Don't stop," Harlan said, his voice very even. "Make the fourth pass." She made the fourth pass. Parallel, 18 inches further. The soil was wet from the first inch. The share moved through it with a different feeling entirely. Not lighter, but more yielding, as if the earth here was close to a state change, the way ice is close to water. The fifth pass. She was at the center stake now, the point she'd marked in November, the point of maximum differential. She positioned the share, said the word, felt the general move. The share entered the ground. For 3 feet, nothing. The same wet soil, the same dark-turned earth. And then the share hit something. Not a hard stop, not a rock, but a layer that felt different from anything above it. A stratum that gave under pressure in a specific way, compacted and dense, and she could feel it through the handles, through her hands and forearms, and into her shoulders. Hollow. Not empty, but hollow. Like pressing on a wall that has something behind it. She kept moving. The general kept walking. And at the 9-foot mark of that fifth pass, the hollow ground did something that none of them had predicted would happen this quickly, in this moment, on this particular cold February morning. A thin line of water appeared at the bottom of the furrow. Not a rush, not a surge. A line, barely wider than a pencil, following the trough of the furrow toward the downhill end of the hollow. Crystal clear, unhurried, moving with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting for an extremely long time and had finally found the opening it needed. Mara stopped walking. She stood at the plow handles with her back to the furrow, facing the ridge, and she did not turn around for almost a full minute. She didn't know why. She felt something very large moving through her, and she needed a moment before she faced what had caused it. When she turned, the line of water had widened to the width of her hand. It was moving downhill, following the grade of the hollow toward the lower end where the old stone trough sat dry and moss-covered and cracked from decades of sitting empty. Evan was on his knees at the near end of the furrow. He'd put his hand in the water and was looking at it running over his fingers with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not quite disbelief, not quite awe. Something that existed before either of those things resolved into words. Harlan was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the moving water. And he was not a man who showed things easily or often, but his face in that moment was entirely open, entirely present, stripped of everything except the particular recognition of a person who has seen something confirmed that he had believed, but had not been certain of. He looked up and found Mara's eyes. "Your grandfather was right," he said. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice quite yet. The water reached the stone trough in 11 minutes. It came in quietly. No announcement, just the thin, bright sound of water finding the old basin, and the first sound it made against the dry stone was so small that you could have missed it if you weren't listening, but all three of them were listening, and none of them missed it. Mara walked to the trough and stood over it and watched the water level rise. It was slow. It would be slow for a while, she understood. The opening was still new, and the compaction around it still substantial, and the spring would need time to establish its flow fully. But it was rising. Steady, clear, and cold. She put her hand in it. The cold went all the way up her arm. That particular cold of mountain water, the kind that has been underground long enough to carry the temperature of deep earth, the kind you only feel in certain places and that you remember for years after. "How deep do you think it is?" Evan asked, standing behind her. "Deep enough," she said. "It's been there a long time." She stood up. She looked at the general, standing at the edge of the hollow where she'd left him, monumentally patient, his breath making slow clouds. He was looking at the trough with something she wouldn't call recognition because she was trying to be careful about attributing too much to animals, but which was not nothing. "You knew," she said to him. Not angry, not even surprised. He looked at her, then back at the trough, then dropped his enormous head and pulled a mouthful of dead winter grass from the edge of the hollow with the composure of an animal that had made its contribution and considered the conversation complete. The three of them stood in the hollow for a long time after that, not talking much, watching the water find its level in the old stone basin. The February sky above the hickory trees was the flat white of cloud cover without wind, the kind of sky that holds everything still, and the only sounds were the water and the breathing of the animals and the occasional crack of frozen wood settling in the trees. Mara was thinking about her grandfather and the photograph and the two men laughing at something she'd never see. She was thinking about 51 years of patience and one bad decision with an excavator and the journals he'd kept anyway, recording what he knew, trusting that someone would eventually read them right. She was thinking about the fact that the county still believed she had failed. Every rancher, every neighbor, every person who had stood at that auction and laughed, not one of them knew what was happening on the northwest face of Greer's Ridge on this particular February morning. The mountain had produced something extraordinary, and the valley had no idea. She wasn't ready to tell them. Not yet. The water was new and fragile, and she needed to understand what she had before she showed it to anyone who might not be careful with it. "Nobody says anything," she said, to Harlan and Evan both. Evan looked up. "Nobody?" "Not yet. I need to measure it for a few weeks. Make sure the flow is stable. Make sure the bank doesn't seal back up." She looked at both of them. "This didn't happen yet. As far as anyone outside this hollow knows, nothing has changed." Harlan looked at her steadily. "You understand that if this holds," he said carefully, "this is going to be the most significant thing to happen on this mountain in 50 years. "I know," she said. "That's why I need to be sure first." He nodded. That was the end of the discussion. She walked the plow out of the hollow herself, leading the general and pair back down the logging trail in the flat white light, with the sound of water still in her ears, and she kept her face neutral the whole way down, the way her grandfather had apparently kept his face neutral at the auction where nobody wanted the animals she'd just watched move water, because Thomas Ellsworth had understood something that she was only now beginning to fully grasp. The mountain didn't owe anyone an announcement. The water didn't perform. The important things happened quietly, and you protected them until they were strong enough to speak for themselves. She put the animals up and cleaned the tack and went inside and wrote 11 pages of notes in her newest notebook, every measurement and observation she could capture, the water level in the trough, the temperature, the clarity, the rate of rise over the 40 minutes they'd stood there watching. Then she opened the 5th journal and put it in front of her and looked at her grandfather's handwriting for a long time. She picked up her pen. Below his last entry, the one that ended with, "We just had to ask right," she wrote 5 words in her own handwriting, below his, the two of them sharing the page across the years between them. "I asked right, Pop." Finally. She measured the trough every morning for the first 2 weeks without telling anyone. The notebook she used for this was different from the others, smaller, more utilitarian, the kind sold in grocery store checkout lanes. Nothing special about it except that it was dedicated entirely to the spring. Each entry had the date, the time, the water level measured against a nail she'd driven into the stone at a consistent point, the temperature taken with the probe thermometer, and a brief notation about the clarity and flow rate. She did this at 5:15 every morning before the animals were fed, before coffee, before anything else, because she'd decided that the spring got her first attention of the day until she understood what it was doing. What it was doing in those first 2 weeks was building. The flow wasn't consistent. It fluctuated, some mornings stronger than others, twice dropping back to a trickle that made her stomach clench before recovering by afternoon. On the 9th day, she'd gone up to the hollow in the dark at 2 in the morning because she'd woken from a dream she couldn't remember and had a fear she couldn't name, and she'd stood at the trough with her flashlight and found the water still moving, still clear, still cold. And she'd stood there in the February dark for 20 minutes before she was willing to go back down. Evan found the entry for that night in her notebook. She'd left it open on the table. And he didn't say anything about it directly. He just arrived the next Saturday with an extra coil of waterproof cable and a cheap battery-powered sensor that he'd apparently ordered online with his own money. And he rigged a rudimentary water level monitor that would send an alert to her phone if the flow dropped below a threshold he helped her set. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said, and kept working. She let him. Some things are better received without a full sentence around them. By the third week, the flow had stabilized into something she could begin to trust. The fluctuations were still there, but smaller. The range narrowing as the spring established itself, the surrounding compaction slowly yielding to the changed pressure environment. Harlan came up on a Thursday afternoon and crouched at the trough for a long time, not measuring anything, just looking. "It's holding," he said. "It's holding," she agreed. He stood up carefully. "You need to make more passes. The opening is still narrow. If you want this to be a real source, something that feeds the upper pasture, something that can handle a dry summer, you need to widen the channel. More pressure work in the hollow, further out from the center." "How much more?" "Weeks," he said. "Maybe a month of regular passes, working in expanding circles from the center point." "You're not done. You've opened a door. You haven't built the hallway yet." This was not what she wanted to hear, not because she didn't believe him, but because the debt payment in March was 3 weeks away, and she'd been quietly calculating whether the spring's existence alone might be enough to leverage a conversation with the bank about extending her timeline. She hadn't had that conversation yet. She wasn't sure she had the right argument for it. She went to the bank in the third week of February. The loan officer was a man named Garrett Phelps, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered bad news frequently enough that he'd learned to remove the weather from his face when doing it. He'd handled the Ellsworth account since Thomas's last restructuring, and he knew the numbers as well as Mara did, which was to say he knew exactly how tight they were. She sat across the desk from him and laid out what she had: the spring data, the notebook entries, the temperature readings, the photograph of the stone trough with water in it that she'd taken on a clear morning when the light was good. She presented it the way she'd learned to present things, without overselling, without drama, with the facts arranged in the order that made the most sense. Garrett Phelps listened. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the notebook. Then he said, "This is impressive work, Mara. I mean that. But a spring on a mountain property isn't a bankable asset until it's been assessed, permitted, and demonstrated to produce consistent volume over a full seasonal cycle. We're talking about a minimum of 12 months of documented flow data before any lender is going to modify terms based on a water source." "I know that," she said. "I'm not asking you to count it as an asset yet. I'm asking for 60 days. "On what basis?" "On the basis that I've done something nobody believed was possible, and I need time to prove it's sustainable." She paused. "And on the basis that if you foreclose on this property in March, you'll be taking a farm that is actively producing a natural water source in a drought year, and you'll be selling it to someone who probably won't understand what they have." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his face. "60 days, he said finally. "I can give you 60 days without a formal extension. After that, we need demonstrated revenue, or we need to talk about restructuring in a more significant way." She drove home with 60 days and no plan for what to do with them yet, which was approximately 60 days more than she'd had before the meeting, and she decided to count that as progress. The work in the hollow continued. Every other morning, weather permitting, she and Evan walked the general in pair through the expanding pattern Harlan had prescribed. Wider circles from the center point, shallow passes, patient repetition. The ground responded. It was not fast, and it was not dramatic, but it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The soil in the hollow was changing texture, loosening incrementally from the compaction of 40 years, and the spring was responding to each new pass with small but measurable increases in flow. By early March, the trough was overflowing, not dramatically, not a cascade, not a spectacle. A steady overflow over the low side of the stone rim, running downhill through the dead winter grass in a thin, bright line toward the lower pasture. Mara stood at the trough one morning and watched the overflow and felt something move through her that she couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't triumph. It was more like the feeling of a thing being restored to its correct shape, the particular satisfaction of watching something broken become whole again that had nothing to do with her personally, except that she had been present and had done what was needed. She took her measurements. She wrote them down. She took 12 photographs from different angles with the morning light on the water because the morning light was honest, and she wanted honest documentation. Then she called Harlan. "It's overflowing," she said when he picked up. A pause, then, "In March." In March. Another pause. Before the snow melt has had time to contribute significantly. Yes. She heard him exhale. Not dramatically, just a breath released, the breath of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying since February. Your grandfather would have had a great deal to say about this, he said, most of it unsuitable for public conversation. She laughed. It came out shorter than she expected, rougher, and then she had to put the phone down for a minute because something was moving through her chest that needed space, and she stood at the kitchen window looking at the ridge with her hand pressed flat against the glass, and when she picked the phone back up, she said, I know. What are you going to do? He asked. Keep measuring, she said. Keep working the hollow, and wait. What she was waiting for was what happened next in every story of this kind, the moment when the private becomes public, not because you chose it, but because the land doesn't keep secrets the way people do. She'd known since February that the spring's existence would eventually announce itself, that the greening of the upper pasture and the return of water to the lower fields would be visible from the county road to anyone paying attention, and that in a drought year, people in Culver County were paying very close attention to water. She'd wanted more time. She hadn't gotten it. The first person to notice was not a neighbor. It was Del Carver, who ran the agricultural supply store in town and who drove past the base of Greer's Ridge on his way home every evening and who had been watching the Ellsworth fields go from winter dead to tentatively green with the particular attention of a man who sold things to farmers and therefore tracked land health the way other people tracked weather. He stopped his truck on the county road on a Tuesday evening in mid-March and looked up the ridge at pasture grass that had no business being that color at that time of year in the middle of a drought. And he stood outside his truck in the cold for 3 minutes before he got back in and drove home and called his neighbor, who called her cousin, who worked at the feed co-op and mentioned it to 2 other people. And by the following weekend, the information had completed its circuit through the county's informal intelligence network and arrived inevitably at Wade Mercer's kitchen table. Mercer's own spread was showing drought stress that he hadn't fully acknowledged yet, not publicly. His lower pastures had gone hard in January and hadn't recovered the way they usually did by March. He'd increased his hay purchases and decreased his herd movement to conserve what grass remained, and he'd been doing these things quietly, without announcing the problem, because Wade Mercer did not announce problems. He managed them, or he redirected attention from them, or he waited for them to resolve on their own. All strategies that had worked for him before and that were working less well this time because the drought was not interested in his management style. When he heard about the Ellsworth pastures, he didn't say anything immediately. He listened to the person telling him, his ranch foreman, a measured man named Cates, who didn't embellish. And then he said he'd look into it, which meant nothing and everything, which was also Wade Mercer's management style. He drove out to the county road 3 days later in the early evening and stopped at the same point where Del Carver had stopped. He looked up the ridge. The upper pasture was green, not the tentative, stressed green of marginal drought survival, genuinely green, the deep color of grass that has consistent water access. Even from the road, he could see the difference from every other field in his line of sight, all of which were showing the flat tan of drought-stressed winter pasture that hadn't recovered. He sat in his truck for a long time. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had been certain for a long time about certain things, and certainty is not the same as stupidity, though it can produce similar outcomes. He sat with what he was looking at, and he did the only honest accounting he was capable of. He looked at the pasture, and he looked at what it meant, and he could not make it mean something other than what it was. He drove back without stopping at the farm. He needed to think first. Mara didn't know about Mercer's drive-by. She was managing her own situation, which had developed several new complications in the days since the trough overflow. The first was that the old pond in the lower field, a stock pond that had been dry since the drought's first year, had begun to show water at its lowest point. Not much. A dark circle of mud at the center, wet in a way that hadn't been there in months. She'd measured it daily since she noticed it, and the wet circle was expanding, slowly, as the restored spring's water table influence worked its way through the underground geology of the ridge. The second complication was that she'd found a crack in the upper section of the stone trough that she hadn't noticed before, a vertical split at the east corner that was leaking a thin stream down the outside of the stone. She'd patched it with hydraulic cement that Evan had picked up from Dix's shop, working in cold that made the cement finicky, and the patch had held, but she was watching it. The third complication was the grass itself. The upper pasture's recovery had been faster than she'd expected, and the herd had shifted their grazing patterns to take advantage of it, which was good for the animals but complicated her management. She needed to rotate them carefully to avoid overgrazing the recovering areas before the root systems had established themselves, which meant more fence management, which meant more of Evan's time on Saturdays, and Evan had mentioned with his characteristic directness that Mercer had started making comments about his Saturday availability. "What kind of comments?" Mara asked. "The kind that aren't quite a question," Evan said. "He hasn't asked me directly. He just says things in my hearing about people who don't know where their loyalties are." "Do you want to stop coming?" He looked at her with an expression that made the question feel slightly absurd. "No." "If he fires you?" "Then he fires me." He said it the way he said most things, simply, without performance. "I'm not going to stop doing the right thing because someone might be unhappy about it." She nodded. She didn't push it further. Some people mean what they say, and Evan was one of them. The morning Wade Mercer came to the farm, Mara was at the trough measuring when she heard a truck on the drive. She recognized it from 100 yards. The dark green Mercer ranch truck, the one with the cracked left taillight he'd never bothered to fix. She watched it park, and she watched him get out, and she stood at the trough with her notebook in her hand and waited. He came up the logging trail slowly. He was wearing his ranch coat and his usual cap, and he had his hands in his pockets, which was different from how he usually held himself. Usually Wade Mercer took up the space he occupied with intention, shoulders back, presence announced. Today he was slightly contained. She noticed it and said nothing. He stopped at the edge of the hollow. He looked at the trough, at the overflow line cutting through the march grass, at the hickory trees and the disturbed soil of the work passes, all of it visible and plain. He didn't say anything for a long time. Mara waited. She was good at waiting now. 4 months on the ridge had made her good at it in a way she hadn't expected. Waiting had become less like absence and more like a skill, an active form of attention. "How long has it been flowing?" he asked, finally. "Since February," she said. He absorbed that. "February." He looked at the trough again. "Your grandfather believed this was here." "Yes." "And the oxen." He stopped. He was working through something, and she could see him working through it, the visible effort of a man revising a fixed belief in real time, which is one of the harder things a person can do, and she gave him room to do it. "The oxen did the work," she said. "The weight, the slow walking, the plow work, everything my grandfather wrote about. The compaction was the problem. The water was always there." He looked at the furrow line still visible in the hollow soil. He was quiet for long enough that a bird landed on the trough rim, looked at him, and flew away again. "I said some things at that auction," he said. "Not an apology, not yet. More like the beginning of an accounting, the first entry in a ledger he was reluctant to open. About you and about your grandfather." "You did," she said. "They weren't—" He stopped again. He pulled his cap off and looked at it and put it back on. "They weren't fair." She looked at him steadily. She'd thought about this moment, not planned it exactly, but thought about it, the various shapes it might take if it came. She'd imagined anger or satisfaction, or the particular cold pleasure of being owed something by someone who'd been certain you were wrong. None of those feelings were present. What she felt instead was something simpler, the weariness of having spent 4 months under the weight of his public ridicule and a clean, clear desire to put that weight down. "Come look at the water," she said. He looked at her. "That's all," she said. "Just come look at it." He walked to the trough. He stood over it the way she had stood over it in February the first time, and he looked at the water for a long moment. He put his hand in it, and she watched his face change at the cold. The particular cold of deep mountain water, the cold that was not weather but geology, the cold that said, "This has been underground for a very long time." He straightened up. His expression was not comfortable. She didn't need it to be comfortable. "My lower pastures are in trouble," he said.
I've been managing it, but the water table is down 15% from last year, and I've got cattle that need what I may not have in August." He said this looking at the trough, not at her, which was the only way a man like Wade Mercer could say something like that to a person he'd publicly humiliated. "I don't know exactly what you have here yet. Neither do you. But if it's what it looks like, it is," she said. "Then you've done something that nobody in this county has done in my lifetime." He paused. "And I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about your grandfather, and I don't know how to—" He stopped. She waited. "I don't know how to say that right," he said finally. "You just did," she said. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time since he'd walked up the logging trail. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not a transformation, just the small but visible movement of a man who had stopped performing certainty. "What do you need?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not the asking of it, she'd half expected something like it, but the simplicity of it, just that. "What do you need?" She thought about the debt payment and the 60 days and the crack in the trough and the fence work and the expanding circles in the hollow that still needed more passes. She thought about all of the practical things she needed, and she looked at Wade Mercer standing at the trough with his hand still wet from her grandfather's spring, and she made a decision. "Nothing right now," she said. "But if this holds through summer, if this water is what I think it is, I'm going to need the county to understand what happened here. Not just on this farm, what this method is, what my grandfather knew, what these animals did." She looked at the general, who was standing at the far edge of the hollow with that same composed patience. "I need people to take it seriously." "I can do that," he said. "I carry weight in this county." "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." He nodded. He looked at the spring one more time. Then he pulled his cap down and turned and walked back down the logging trail, and she watched him go. And she did not feel what she'd expected to feel, which was the clean closure of a wrong being righted. She felt something more complicated than that, the recognition that nothing about what had happened to her had been clean, and nothing about what came next would be clean either, and that was all right. That was just what complicated things felt like when they were real. The word spread the way things spread in small counties, organically, laterally, through 10 different conversations she hadn't been part of, carrying the distortions that all county gossip carries, but also the essential fact, which was real enough to survive the distortions. The Ellsworth girl had found water on the ridge. The old spring. In a drought year. Del Carver came by first on a Saturday morning, bringing coffee he hadn't needed to bring and a frankness she appreciated. He stood at the trough for a while and asked practical questions. Flow rate, volume estimates, whether she'd had a hydrologist look at it. And she answered them as honestly as she could, which meant acknowledging several things she didn't know yet. Then came 2 farmers she didn't know well, men from the south end of the county, whose names she had to check against the county directory after they left. They were polite, a different quality of polite than the kind that covers condescension. Genuinely polite. The politeness of people who had come to look at something and were adjusting their previous understanding of it. They asked about the oxen. One of them asked about the plow. Then came a woman named Sandra Holt, who wrote a column for the county agricultural newsletter, and who was not, she made clear immediately, writing about this without Mara's explicit consent, but who wanted to understand what had happened because she'd been covering Culver County agriculture for 22 years, and she'd never seen anything like what she was hearing described. Mara sat with her on the porch for an hour and a half. She pulled out the journals and showed her the relevant passages. Not all of them. The journals were Thomas's, and she was careful about what she shared. And she walked her through the method, the theory, what Harlan had taught her, what Vreek had written about in the context Thomas had found him through. Sandra Holt listened with the attention of someone who had developed that skill professionally. When Mara finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather documented all of this," she said. "Over 30 years, Mara said, and nobody listened." "He didn't push it either," Mara said. "He wrote it down, and he kept farming, and he trusted that the land would eventually demonstrate what he knew." She paused. "He was more patient than I am." Sandra looked at the journals on the table between them. "Can I come back? When you're ready to tell this more publicly?" "Yes," Mara said, "when I'm ready."
The pastures through April were something she hadn't been prepared for. The upper field first, then the middle section, then the lower pasture as the water table influence worked its way down the gradient, the grass returning with a speed and density that was visibly different from the surrounding county, different from anything she'd seen on the ridge in her lifetime. Not miraculous, not overnight, but consistent and accelerating, the way things grow when they have what they need, which turns out to be sufficient in itself. She moved the herd through the recovering sections on a careful rotation that Harlan helped her map, and the animals responded to the better grass the way animals respond to anything they've been waiting for, without fanfare, with the simple, wholehearted commitment of creatures who do not have mixed feelings about good things. Evan came up one Saturday in early April and stood in the middle of the upper pasture for a long time, just standing in it, and she watched him from the fence. "It doesn't look like the same place," he said. "It isn't," she said. He looked at the ridge above them, at the hickory hollow invisible from where they stood but present, always present now, in her awareness, the way a sound you've been straining to hear becomes, once you've heard it, something you can't unhear. "What are you going to do with all this?" he asked. It was a bigger question than it sounded. She'd been sitting with versions of it since February. "Keep farming," she said. "Do it right. Show people what the journals describe, if they want to learn it." She paused. "There are other farms in this county with compaction problems and sealed springs, probably across the ridge too. My grandfather wasn't documenting something unique to this property. He was documenting something that's true about a lot of mountain land that's been managed the wrong way for too long." Evan turned that over. "So this isn't just about this farm." "It was never just about this farm," she said. "My grandfather understood that. He just couldn't get anyone to listen." "You might be able to," he said. "Not as flattery, as an observation." She looked at the pasture around them, the real and growing green of it, the proof that was standing up on its own without needing her to argue for it. She thought about Wade Mercer at the trough with his wet hand and his quiet question, "What do you need?" She thought about Sandra Holt and the agricultural newsletter and the two farmers from the South County asking about the plow. "Maybe," she said. "We'll see." The pond in the lower field had 3 feet of water in it by the 3rd week of April. She measured it one morning in the early light and stood at the edge and looked at it for a long time, at the reflections of the ridge and the sky and the water that had no business being there, except that it was, because the spring was running and the water table had shifted and the land was doing what land does when it's allowed to, recovering, slowly and without drama, towards some prior version of itself. She took a photograph of it. She sent it to Ruth, who called her within 4 minutes. "Thomas would have cried," Ruth said, which was a remarkable statement about a man neither of them had ever seen shed a tear, and which was therefore more meaningful than conventional expressions of feeling would have been. "I know," Mara said. "That pond has been dry since 1991, Ruth said. "I remember the year it went. He walked down to it every morning for a week after, just looking at the mud." Mara looked at the pond. She thought about Thomas walking down to it in 1991, looking at the mud where water had been, writing about it in journal number 3 with the careful handwriting that never fully betrayed how much it cost him. He'd kept going. He'd written his theories down. He'd underlined things twice. He'd trusted that the right person would eventually read them. She thought she understood now what that trust had required of him, what it meant to believe in something you might not live to see confirmed. She thought she understood it in her body, the way you understand things that have cost you something real, the way the understanding lives not in the mind but in the hands and the shoulders, and the particular tiredness that comes from months of work that nobody around you believed in. She was still tired. She was going to be tired for a while. But the pond was full, and the spring was running, and the general was somewhere on the upper pasture eating good grass, and the mountain had done what her grandfather always said it would do if someone finally asked it right. She put her phone in her pocket and walked back up the hill. The hay contracts started coming in May, before the first cutting was anywhere near ready. Mara hadn't advertised. She hadn't posted anything, hadn't called anyone, hadn't done anything more deliberate than exist on the ridge and let the land speak for itself, which it was now doing in the particular loud language of visibly healthy pasture in a county where most of the grass had gone the color of old straw. The first call came from a cattle operation 30 miles south, A woman named Peg Drummond, who had heard through Sandra Holt's newsletter piece that the Ellsworth farm was producing, and who wanted to know if Mara would consider a forward contract on hay before the season was cut. Mara sat with the phone in her hand after the call and looked at the kitchen table, which still had the journals on it, because the journals had never fully left the kitchen table since October. She'd never done a forward contract. She didn't know the right price to ask. She called Harlan. "What's the drought premium running?" she asked. "Valley floor hay is up 40% from last year," he said. "Good mountain hay with documented water access this drought. You could ask more than that." "How much more?" A pause. "What did she offer?" She hadn't gotten to numbers yet. She wanted to know if I was interested first. "Tell her you're interested," Harlan said. "And then wait for her number. Don't name a price first. You're in a stronger position than you think." She called Peg Drummond back and said she was interested. Peg named a number that was 60% above the previous year's regional average. Mara said she'd think about it, which she did for about 40 minutes, and then called back and said yes. That was the first one. By the end of May, there were 4 more. 2 ranchers from the north end of the county, a small dairy operation over the ridge in the next valley, and a local horse farm whose owner had called 3 times before Mara had answered, and who wanted twice what the others had contracted because she had specific quality requirements and was willing to pay for certainty in an uncertain year. The total value of the forward contracts was more than double what the farm debt had been in October. She sat with that number for a long time, and it didn't feel real, and then it started to feel real, and she called the bank and asked for Garrett Phelps. "I have something for you," she said. She drove in the following Tuesday with the signed contracts in a folder and the spring data from the past 3 months in her notebook. Garrett Phelps looked at the contracts and looked at the notebook and looked at the contracts again, and the weather left his face in a different way than it usually did, not emptied out, but genuinely moved, which was not a thing she'd expected from a bank loan officer and which she found, unexpectedly, moving in return. "This is," he started, and stopped. "Your grandfather would have—" "I know," she said. He cleared the debt payment and restructured the remaining balance at a lower interest rate, citing the demonstrated asset value of the water source and the contracted revenue stream, and she signed 3 pieces of paper and walked out of the bank in the May morning light and stood on the sidewalk for a minute, just breathing. She didn't call anyone. She drove home, changed her boots, and went up to the hollow to take the morning measurements. The spring was running at 3 times its February volume. She'd added 2 more measurement points further down the gradient, and both of them were showing consistent flow that had not been present before the plow work. The upper pond, a smaller depression she'd noticed in March, but hadn't written about yet because she hadn't been sure it was real, had begun to hold water in its lowest point. The land was not finished recovering. It would not be finished for years, probably, the deep compaction having accumulated over decades and the reversal requiring patience she was only beginning to develop. But the direction was clear and the direction was not reversing. Sandra Holt's newsletter piece had come out in late April and had been longer and more detailed than Mara expected. Sandra had done additional research. She'd found references to Aldous Vreek's work in 2 agricultural history archives, had spoken with a soil scientist at the State University who had expressed skeptical but genuine interest in the documented results, and had written the whole thing with the precision of someone who understood that the story was not primarily about Mara, but about Thomas's journals, and the method they described, and the possibility that there were other sealed springs under other compacted mountain farms, waiting for someone to ask right. The response to the piece had been, by county newsletter standards, extraordinary. Sandra told her this on the phone the week after it ran, with a frankness Mara had come to appreciate. "I've been writing this column for 22 years, and I've never had this many people contact me about a single piece. Most of them aren't asking about the water, they're asking about the oxen." "What about them?" "Whether you'd be willing to talk about the method. Some of them have land that sounds similar. Northwest hollows, old stock ponds that dried up, ground that doesn't respond to rain the way it used to." A pause. "And some of them are just—" Sandra stopped. "I think some of them are just moved by it, by the story, by the fact that a 23-year-old woman spent her savings on animals nobody wanted and turned out to be right." Mara didn't know what to do with that last part. She was still not entirely comfortable being a story. She was comfortable being a farmer, was becoming more comfortable with that identity every week. But the storiness of her situation still felt like something happening slightly outside herself, a version of events she could recognize but couldn't fully inhabit. "Tell them they can come," she said. "Not all at once, but tell them they can come." The first group arrived on a Saturday in late May. 6 people, all of them farmers or former farmers, most of them older than Mara by 20 or 30 years, and they walked the hollow with her and listened while she described the process and looked at the trough and the overflow and the furrow line still visible in the hollow soil. And they were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are genuinely reckoning with something. One of them was a man in his late 60s named Calhoun, who farmed a property 2 ridges over and who had the kind of face that life outdoors carves into a particular shape. Angular, weathered, not unkind. He stood at the trough for a long time. Then he said, "I've got a northwest hollow on my property. Pond went dry in 2007. Ground sounds like a drum when you walk it." Mara looked at him. "How long has it been dry?" 17 years. She was quiet for a moment. "Have you got heavy draft animals?" "I've got mules," he said. "Good heavy mules." "They might work," she said, honestly. "I don't know enough yet about the weight differential to say for certain. My grandfather's journals reference oxen specifically, but he was also writing about this specific property. The principle might translate." She paused. "I'd want to know more about your soil profile before I said yes or no." He nodded, not disappointed. Processing. "Would you be willing to look at it?" She thought about it for a real moment, not a polite moment. She had the hay to manage, and the hollow's ongoing work, and the debt restructuring's new payment schedule, and 41 animals whose care did not take days off. She had limits on her time that were genuine and hard. "This fall," she said, "after the first cutting. I'll come look." He nodded again. That was enough for him. She noted it. The same conversation happened in different forms with 4 of the other 5 people who came that Saturday. They had land that matched Thomas's description of the compaction problem. They had dried ponds and northwest hollows, and ground that didn't respond to rain the way it once had. They weren't all farmers. One of them was a retired schoolteacher who had inherited land she didn't know what to do with, and 2 of them were the grown children of farmers who had died and left properties that were underperforming and that the inheritors hadn't known how to address. Mara talked with all of them. She was honest about what she knew and what she didn't know. She showed them the relevant pages of Thomas's journals, not the personal entries, those stayed private, but the technical observations, the notes on soil behavior and water table dynamics, and the specific characteristics of the animals he'd concluded were necessary. She realized, walking back to the house that afternoon with the visitors' cars pulling out of the drive, that she'd been teaching. Not performing teaching, not standing in front of a room with a lesson plan, just talking about what she knew with people who needed to know it, the way her grandfather had talked to her on those summer walks along the fence lines, saying things she hadn't understood until years later. The information passing forward, the only way information like that can pass, person to person, imperfectly, in pieces, hoping the recipient is paying the right kind of attention. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the 6th journal, the last one, the one that stopped in 2019, to the final entry. She'd read it before. She read it again. Thomas had written it in a shaky hand that spoke to his health at the end. "I am not sure anyone will read these. That's all right. I wrote them for the land as much as for any person. The land doesn't forget what it knows just because the people have. If the right person comes along and pays attention, the mountain will tell them what it needs. It always does. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." She closed the journal. She sat with it for a minute. Then she picked up her pen and opened to the page after the final entry and wrote, "People came today. They're going to go home and look at their land differently. That's because of you. I want you to know that." She capped the pen and put the journal back with the others. Harlan came by the following week. He was moving more slowly than he had in January. His knees had been bad through the cold spring. He'd mentioned it without complaint a few times, the way he mentioned things that couldn't be fixed but could be acknowledged. He walked the hollow with her in the late afternoon light, and they stood at the trough together, and he looked at the water for a long time. "You're going to have visitors all summer," he said. I know. That's going to take time you don't have. I know that too. He was quiet. You could charge for it. A workshop, something formal. People pay for this kind of knowledge. She'd thought about that. She'd thought about it more carefully than she'd let on to anyone. Maybe eventually, she said. Not yet. Right now, I just want people to understand what the journals describe. If I start charging for it before the knowledge is established, before people can see it working beyond this one farm, it becomes about me, and it's not about me. Harlan looked at her sideways. Thomas said the same kind of thing. Drove your grandmother crazy. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. Came up from somewhere genuine. She told you that? She told me a lot of things, he said. She was a frank woman. She thought Thomas was the most right-headed man she'd ever known, and the most difficult to be married to for exactly the same reasons. He paused. She would have liked you. Mara looked at the water in the trough. She hadn't thought much about her grandmother, Thomas's first wife, who had died before Mara was old enough to know her. She existed in the family memory as a presence felt in absences, the way people who leave early always do. What was she like? Mara asked. Patient, Harlan said, but not the kind of patient that gives up, the kind that stays. He pulled his cap down against the late sun. She used to say that the difference between patience and giving up is that patience still believes in the outcome. Giving up has stopped. Mara thought about that for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, through feeding and fence checks, and the nighttime trough measurement she still did out of habit that had become something close to ritual. She thought about it in the context of the 7 months behind her, the auction, the winter, the training, the hollow, the February morning when the water came. And she thought it was as good a description as she'd heard of what had actually carried her through. She had never stopped believing in the outcome. She'd had nights when the belief was very small and very quiet, when it sat in the bottom of her like a coal that's mostly ash but still holds heat. And she'd had nights when common sense made a reasonable argument that she should quit. And she'd had nights when the math was so bad that belief felt less like a virtue and more like a character flaw. But she had not stopped. She was not constitutionally able to stop. Maybe some things are built into a person in ways they didn't choose, but she'd also made the choice, consciously, repeatedly, to keep going. That choice had been Thomas's gift to her as much as the land or the journals. He'd showed her by example what it looked like to commit to something for 51 years without guarantee of vindication. The first cutting happened in the second week of June. She'd arranged a crew, 3 people, one of whom was Evan, who had formally left Wade Mercer's employ in May after Mercer had one final conversation with him about loyalty that Evan had concluded respectfully but without changing his position. He'd come to Mara the morning after and asked if there was enough work on the ridge to justify a full-time arrangement. She'd looked at the contracts on the table and the hollow that still needed expanding and the fence lines that needed seasonal maintenance and the visitors who were going to need managing, and she'd said yes. He'd nodded and started the next day. He hadn't asked what she was paying. She'd told him anyway, and it was less than Mercer had paid, and he'd said that was fine for now, and she'd said it wouldn't stay that way, and they'd left it there. The cutting went 3 days. The hay that came off the upper pasture was dense and green in a way that the crew remarked on without being asked. These were people who had been cutting hay in Culver County for years, and they knew what the drought was doing to everyone else's fields, and they knew what they were looking at. One of them, a woman named Terry, who ran the cutting equipment with a competence that made everything look easier than it was, stopped the machine at the end of the second day and climbed down and stood in the middle of the upper field. My family farms the next ridge over, she said, not to anyone specific. We've got maybe half this yield. Good year. We'd have 3/4. She looked at the cut field around her. This isn't normal. No, Mara said. It's not. What did you do? Mara took a breath and told her about the spring. Briefly, clearly, the way she'd learned to tell it. The essential facts without the embroidery because the facts were sufficient. Terry listened. She looked at the field. She looked at the ridge above them. My grandfather used to say there was a spring on our property, she said, up on the northwest side. Old hickory grove up there. Mara looked at her steadily. He said it went underground, Terry continued. Before his time, he thought. Come see me in the fall, Mara said. Wade Mercer came to collect on his implicit promise in July, when the drought had made its intentions for the summer definitively clear. He'd managed to get through June on reserves, but July brought the kind of heat that settled arguments, and by mid-July his south pastures were in the kind of shape that couldn't be managed quietly anymore. He came up the ridge on a Tuesday morning without calling ahead, which she'd come to understand was simply how he operated. He wasn't rude about it, he just didn't think to call first, a habit of a man who had always simply arrived at places and been accommodated. He found her in the hollow, running a final pass with the general before the summer heat made the work impractical for the animals. He waited at the edge until she'd completed the pass and brought the general back. Then he said, without preamble, "I've got a situation." "I know," she said. "The south pastures." He looked at her. "You can see it from the road?" "I can see it from here," she said. "And people talk." He accepted that. "I've got cattle that need water and grass that isn't coming back without help I don't know how to give it." He paused. "I have a northwest section on the back of my property, old stone trough up there. Been dry since I bought the place, which was 1987. She looked at the general, who was standing beside her with the reliable stillness that she no longer found extraordinary because it had become simply part of her day, part of the landscape of the farm. She thought about her forward contracts and her payment schedule, and Evan and the 6 journals on the kitchen table, and Calhoun with his heavy mules on his property 2 ridges over. She thought about the man who had pointed at her at an auction and said the word senile about her grandfather. She looked at Wade Mercer. He was not a comfortable man to look at in this moment. He knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "I can come look at it," she said. "I can't promise anything. Some of the compaction is too deep or the geology is wrong and the method doesn't apply. I'd need to walk the section and read the ground and look at your soil profile and go through whatever records you have from when the trough was active." "I'll have everything you need," he said. "And I'll need your animals," she said. "Your cattle are the wrong weight. I'd need to work with your heaviest draft animals if you have them, or look at bringing in animals from someone who does. The specific weight and gait are part of the method. You can't substitute lighter animals." He nodded. "I've got 2 Belgian crosses, big ones. Calvin Pickett sold them to me years ago." He paused, and something crossed his face. A recognition, the kind that comes when you understand that the threads of a story were connected before you could see the pattern. "Same line as your oxen, probably." Mara looked at him. The same line as her oxen. Calvin Pickett's animals, on Mercer's property, bought years before the son had sold the rest of the herd to the auction where Mara had found them. The mountain's threads ran a long way back. "Same line," she said quietly. "Yes, that might work." She went to Mercer's property the following Saturday with Evan, who drove and said almost nothing on the way, which was his way of giving her room to think. They walked the northwest section for 2 hours, and she did what her grandfather's journals had taught her to do. She struck the ground in intervals, listening to the note the earth gave back, looking for the lower register, the hollowness that said something was different beneath. She found it in 3 places. The largest was adjacent to the old stone trough, a section of ground maybe 40 feet in diameter that rang differently from everything around it. A sound you could argue yourself out of if you were committed to skepticism, but couldn't entirely dismiss if you were honest. "Same as the hollow," Evan said, standing at the far edge of the section, having walked it himself while she worked the center. "Close enough," she said. Wade Mercer had followed them at a respectful distance, which was new for him, and he came up now and looked at the section she'd indicated. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think your grandfather was right about the spring," she said. "I think it's there. Whether we can open it the same way depends on how deep the compaction is and how the water's been moving since the drought of '89. She looked at him directly. "I won't know until we try. And if we try and it doesn't work, that's the answer. I won't make you promises I can't keep." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need to start?" She told him. It was a longer list than she'd started with in November on her own property. She knew what she was doing now, or knew it better, and better knowledge meant understanding all the things that could go wrong and preparing for them. She needed the Belgian crosses handled and evaluated, a proper yoke assessment, a walking plow that would need work, and enough time on the property through the fall to do the process with the patience it required. He agreed to everything without negotiating. She wasn't sure if that was contrition or practicality or both, and she decided it didn't matter. What mattered was the work. The summer moved forward the way summers do when you're too busy to watch them. The hay that came off the Ellsworth fields filled 3 different buyers' contracts, and a small surplus she'd sold at the drought premium rate to 2 additional buyers who'd contacted her through people who'd contacted her through Sandra Holt's piece. The money covered the debt restructuring payment, with enough left over that she'd been able to do things she'd deferred since October. Replace the water heater in the farmhouse, buy proper fencing materials for the lower section, get actual work gloves that fit her hands correctly. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that signal not that you've won, but that you're no longer in immediate danger of losing, which is its own particular form of relief. Ruth came out to the farm in August, which she rarely did. The drive was long for her, and the farm road was rough on her car, and she was 81 and managed her energy with the practicality of someone who understood it was a finite resource. She walked with Mara up to the hollow, slowly, taking her time, and stood at the trough for a long time without speaking. Mara stood beside her and didn't fill the silence. Ruth put her hand in the water. She held it there for a moment, then took it out and dried it on the side of her jacket. "He came up here once," she said. "Thomas, right before his health went. He called me afterward and said—" She stopped. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet where someone is deciding whether to say the next thing. "He said he thought he'd found the way to do it, but he didn't have the time left to try it himself. He said he'd written it all down, and he hoped someone would find it." Mara looked at the water. "He didn't tell you about the journals specifically?" she asked. "He was like that. He told you the shape of a thing and trusted you to find the details." Ruth looked at the ridge above them. "I didn't know you'd be the one. I hoped, but I didn't know." "Why me?" "He had other grandchildren." Ruth was quiet for a long time, long enough that the question seemed to settle into the earth like water. "Because you're the one who came," she said finally. "That's always been the whole of it, with most things. Not who's the smartest or the best prepared. Who shows up when it's hard." Mara stood with that. It was not a comfortable thing to stand with because it felt true, in a way that required something of her, a kind of responsibility she hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. Calhoun came in September, as she'd promised. He brought photographs of his Northwest Hollow and his soil records, and a quiet intentionality that she respected. They walked his property on a Saturday that had the first genuine fall cool in it, the air sharp and honest, and she found the same low note in his ground that she'd found on her own ridge and later on Mercer's. 3 hollows now with the same signature. 3 pieces of evidence that what Thomas had documented was not specific to one mountain's quirks, but a pattern, a land condition with a recognizable character, findable if you knew what to look for. She brought Harlan with her to Calhoun's property, and the 3 of them walked the ground together, the old farmer and the old horseman, and the young woman who'd spent a year learning to listen to a mountain, and they talked about what they were seeing in the particular shorthand of people who share a frame of reference without having explicitly agreed on it. On the drive home, Harlan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know what Thomas wanted, really?" "Tell me," she said. "He wanted someone to prove it was repeatable," Harlan said. "Not just on his property. He wasn't trying to save one farm. He was trying to prove the method worked." He paused. "You've got 3 properties with the signature now. If Calhoun's works—" "It's not 3 data points yet," she said. "It's 2 confirmed and 1 hypothesis." "I know, but it's more than 1. She drove without speaking for a while, watching the road and the ridge lines above it, the familiar shapes of the county she'd come to know in a different way than she'd expected when she drove up here in October with nothing but her grandfather's coat and his debt and his journals. "He would have kept going," she said finally, "even with 1. He kept going for 50 years on 1 property. He didn't need the county to validate it." "No," Harlan said. "He didn't. But you might be able to give them something he couldn't." "What's that?" "A reason to believe before they see it for themselves." He looked out the window at a field going brown at the road's edge. He could only show his own land. "You're showing other people's land. That's different. That's evidence."
The fall settled into the ridge with the usual combination of beauty and cold that mountain falls produce, generous and demanding at once. The colors generous, the temperature demanding, the days shortening in a way that compressed the work into a narrower window without reducing its volume. Mara had the hollow to continue, Mercer's property to begin, Calhoun's property to evaluate, and a farm that needed its own pre-winter preparation on top of all of it. She was tired in a way that had become structural, built into her body the way the ridge was built into the landscape. Not an acute tiredness that sleep solved, but a tiredness she carried into sleep and woke still holding. The cost of a year that had asked more than she'd had, and then asked more again. She knew the cost. She paid it. She kept the spring notebook going every morning at 5:15, the trough measurement, the temperature, the flow rate, the small faithful record of a thing she'd helped into existence and now had the ongoing responsibility to observe. The spring did not disappoint her. Through the drought summer and into the dry fall, it ran stronger than it had in February, the widened channel that the spring work had opened settling into its new configuration, the water finding the path of least resistance downhill, the way water always does when given the chance. The pond in the lower field had held through the summer without diminishing. The upper pasture had gone into fall with root systems that were visibly stronger than the surrounding county's land. She could see it in how the grass responded to the first fall rains, recovering faster, holding more moisture. The soil structure that had been changing since February, showing its character in the way water moved into it instead of off of it. Sandra Holt came back in October, the anniversary month, to update her original piece. They sat on the porch in jackets with coffee, and Sandra recorded their conversation on her phone with Mara's permission, and then didn't use most of what Mara said, and instead wrote primarily about Thomas's journals, which was the right call, and which Mara appreciated. "People want to know about you," Sandra said. "What it was like, personally. The fear part." "The fear was real," Mara said. "I don't need to go into detail about it." "Why not?" Mara thought about it. "Because the point isn't my courage. The point is that my grandfather was right, and the method works, and there are other properties in this county with sealed springs under compacted ground. The point is the land. If people focus on me being brave or whatever they want to call it, they miss the thing that actually matters." Sandra looked at her over her coffee cup. "You're going to be 40 years old someday, and you're going to wish you'd let someone write the full story while it was still new." Mara almost smiled. "Maybe, but not yet." What she did allow, and what she'd been thinking about since the Saturday visitors in May, was the journals. Not all of them. The personal entries stayed private. Thomas's arguments with himself and his grief and his stubbornness were not public property, and she had no intention of making them so. But the technical content, the observations about soil behavior, the notes on compaction dynamics and water table indicators, the descriptions of the specific animal characteristics required for the pressure cultivation work, that was meant to be shared. She'd known it since she first read them carefully. Thomas had written those sections not as a private diary, but as a record, a document intended for someone, even if he hadn't been sure who. She'd started transcribing them in July, working in the evenings when the day's physical work was done, typing them into a format that could be shared. She'd had Harlan review the sections about animal handling, and he'd made corrections and additions. She'd had a soil scientist from the state university, the skeptical one Sandra had found for her original piece, who had since made 2 visits to the farm and was no longer skeptical, review the sections about compaction dynamics, and add context from current soil science that made Thomas's observations legible to people with formal agricultural training. It wasn't a book. It wasn't trying to be a book. It was a working document, 43 pages, with Thomas's words at the core and other people's knowledge organized around them, and she intended to give it away to anyone who asked for it and charged nothing for it, and put Thomas's name on the cover and her name nowhere. Harlan disagreed with the last part. They argued about it mildly one evening in the kitchen, the way they argued about things, which was directly and without escalation and usually ending where it had started. "Your name should be on it," he said. "You did the work." "He did the work," she said. "I followed his instructions." Mara. Harlan. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You are
without question, the most difficult person I have worked with in 50 years of working with farmers. You said that was a compliment when you said it about my grandfather. It is a compliment, he said. It's still exhausting. Her name did not appear on the document. She compromised by including an acknowledgement that said the methods described had been field tested on Greer's Ridge by the author's granddaughter in partnership with Harlan Beach, which Harlan accepted with the grace of a man who knew when he'd gotten what was available. She sent the document to Calhoun and to Sandra Holt and to the woman from the dairy operation and to 4 other people who had come to the farm with Northwest hollows on their properties and hope in their faces. She sent it to a county extension office that had, in an irony Thomas would have appreciated, requested it after reading Sandra's piece in the newsletter. She sent it to the State University soil scientist, who passed it to 2 colleagues. She did not send it to Wade Mercer because Mercer's work was ongoing and because their relationship operated in person, not on paper. The work on Mercer's northwest section had begun in September with his Belgian crosses, enormous animals, heavier than the general, with a placid temperament that made them easier to handle than they looked. Evan had evaluated them and declared them suitable. Mar had started the plow work with Mercer present, and Mercer had watched in the same silence he'd brought to the Ellsworth Hollow, the silence of a man recalibrating something he'd believed for a long time. By late October, the Mercer section was showing the first signs. The soil temperature differential was appearing at the center point. The ground note had changed in a radius extending from the original test area. Nothing to announce yet. But the direction was right. One morning in late October, she was in the hollow, running what she'd decided would be the final scheduled pass of the season. The expanded pattern complete, the work reaching what Thomas's journals described as a maintenance phase, the major structural change accomplished, and the spring now self-sustaining within the geology that supported it. And she stopped at the end of the pass and stood at the trough and looked at the water the way she always looked at it. It had been a year. Not exactly. The anniversary of the auction was still 2 weeks away, but close enough that the year was present in her awareness as a shape, a thing she could see the edges of now that she was near enough to it. She thought about October of last year, the coat, the debt, the 41 animals, the notebook. The voice that had called her grandfather senile into a microphone in front of a crowd, the hand that hadn't shaken when she signed. She thought about Harlan's bad knees on cold mornings, continuing anyway. She thought about Evan arriving at 5:45, consistently, without being asked. She thought about Ruth's hand in the water and the photograph of the 2 men laughing at something outside the frame. She thought about Thomas writing in the 6th journal. If the right person comes along and pays attention, the mountain will tell them what it needs. The water in the trough was clear and cold and moving. The general was somewhere in the upper pasture, doing what he always did, existing with the enormous patient authority of an animal that had done what was asked of it and now simply was, grazing in the fall light, making no argument about what he deserved. Mara put her hand in the spring one more time. The cold went up her arm to her shoulder. She was 24 years old. She had a farm that was alive, a debt that was manageable, a method that was documented, and at least 3 properties in her county where she believed the same thing could happen if someone was willing to do the patient work of asking the land right. She was still tired. She would probably be tired for a long time. Tired had become a baseline condition rather than a crisis, something to manage rather than escape, and she'd made a kind of peace with it that was not resignation but accommodation, the way you accommodate the weight of anything worth carrying. She straightened up. She took her hand out of the water and dried it on her jacket and wrote the morning's numbers in the spring notebook. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her pocket, and went to get the general. There was work to do.